Now we'll look at a few examples where we do actually need to simplify first by factoring. So for the first one here, we've got x squared minus 4 over x squared minus x minus 2. The first step is that we're going to factor the numerator and the denominator as much as we can. So the numerator is x squared minus 4. That's a difference of squares. That factors into x plus 2, x minus 2. The denominator, that's a trinomial. Remember, this is the one where you find which values for A, B, and C work out so that AC, you find out what multiplies to AC but then adds up to B. So in this question, our AC would be 1 times negative 2, which is negative 2, and then our B would be negative 1, and the two numbers that multiply to negative 2 but add up to negative 1 are negative 2 and positive 1. So then you would replace the middle term with the negative 2x and the positive 1x, and you would solve this by grouping. And we'd find our GCFs and factor out our common binomial, and that ends up factoring into x minus 2, x plus 1. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look for something in the numerator and the denominator that's the same, a factor that's the same. In this case, we have an x minus 2 and an x minus 2 that are common factors. So we'd have an x plus 2 left in the numerator and an x plus 1 left in the denominator. Remember, we cannot cancel out the x's. We can't cancel across addition. We can only cancel factors, which are things that are separated by multiplication. So as far as we can go in terms of simplifying is x plus 2 over x plus 1. Don't forget, when we find the excluded values or the domain restrictions, you go back to the step before you simplified. So before we crossed this off, we want the denominator, the x squared minus x minus 2, to be equal to 0, and we already factored that earlier. That was when x plus 1 and x minus 2, and we would solve each of those for x using our zero product property. And we've got two excluded values this time. For the first one, we would subtract 1 from both sides and get x equals negative 1. For the second one, we'd add 2 to both sides and get x equals 2. So our two excluded values are that x cannot equal negative 1 and x cannot equal 2. For the next one, we're also going to factor the numerator and denominator. I'm going to erase what we have here so I have some room to write. So these are both trinomials. We're going to use the 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. We're going to factor that in the same method we did the last one. Our AC value would be negative 6, B value would be negative 5. The two numbers that would multiply to negative 6 but add up to negative 5 would be negative 6 and positive 1. So we're going to replace our middle term with a negative 6x and a positive 1x, and we'll use the grouping method to factor those. We've got our common binomial of x minus 3, and then when we factor that out, we'd be left with a 2x plus 1. So our numerator factors into x minus 3 times 2x plus 1. And then we'll also need to factor our denominator. So we'll do this again with the 6x squared minus 7x minus 5. And our AC value here would be negative 30, and our B value would be negative 7. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 30 but add up to negative 7. Those two values would be -10 and +3. They multiply to -30 and add up to +7. Remember, if you think for a little while and you can't come up with those numbers, then you start making a list. 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10. Eventually you'll find those. And recall, we replace the middle term with those two values. And then we do factoring by grouping. And we factor out the common binomial. So the denominator factors into 3x minus 5 times 2x plus 1. And now that we've got both of those factored, we looked for a common factor that we can reduce and simplify that out with. 2x plus 1 divided by 2x plus 1 would be 0. Or would be 1 rather, sorry about that. So we can reduce those, and we're left with x minus 3 over 3x minus 5. There are no common factors here other than 1, so there's nothing else we can simplify. Don't forget, when you go to find the excluded values, you're going back to the original problem, setting that denominator equal to 0 and solving. Now we already factored this earlier. So our factors are 3x minus 5 and 2x plus 1, and we'll use the zero product property, setting both of those equal to 0. And I'm going to come over here, kind of running out of room a little bit. So 3x minus 5 equals 0. We would add 5 to both sides and then divide by 3. And our first excluded value would be at 5/3. And then 2x plus 1 equals 0. We would subtract 1 from both sides and then divide by 2. So our second excluded value would be at -1/2. So our excluded values are that x cannot be equal to 5/3 and x cannot be equal to -1/2.